Rivian just had their first quarter 2025 earnings call, and we learned a lot about the health of Rivian, as well as the current state and progress of Rivian R2 production, some surprising information about AI and autonomy, as well as a general barometer about what to expect from them going forward. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Before we get started, I want to cover two things. First of all is I'm coming at this from my own experience as a software CEO with well over a decade of running marketing company that builds marketing software. So that is definitely the perspective I'm coming at here. Secondly, this is not financial advice. I cover a lot about Rivian as a hobby for my YouTube channel here. I'm excited about their products. We happen to own a Gen 2 Rivian R1T and a Gen 2 Rivian R1S. I've been following them since they were first announced back at the 2018 LA Auto Show. I think that they do a lot of interesting things as a company. Their products are very interesting and unique in the marketplace. They are far from perfect, but there are a lot of things that are progressing for this software company that happens to make vehicles. I also feel compelled to let you know in full disclosure that I do own some Rivian shares. I've bought them over the last few years. I've dollar cost averaged. It represents a very small minority of my overall portfolio. And of that portfolio, I consider my Rivian shares to be the riskiest investments that I have. And I would encourage you to treat them as very risky as well. I think that there's a lot of volatility and there's going to be a lot of up and down on this stock over the years. And so this is not advice to buy. This is not advice to sell. This is not advice to do anything with stocks. That's just my own personal opinion. Now, we're going to dive in about the health. I'm going to give you my analysis as a person who enjoys the product line, what I hope to see from it, and what clues I think we can gather from what Rivian has shared during this particular earnings call. So let's go ahead and get started in sort of a stream as how things happened on the call, and I'll cover the health and what's coming up next. The first thing that Rivian covered is really their core business highlights, and there's definitely some concerns baked in here as well. I think the overall takeaway that you should have here, though, is that despite lower than expected deliveries, which we already knew about because they announced those earlier, just about everything else in this report was a beat. Now, they have revised their 2025 delivery guidance down approximately 10%. This is the largest negative that we have. I think this is a reflection of not only last quarter's performance of making more vehicles than they sold, but I think this is a overarching theme for being a high-priced luxury vehicle in the current uncertain marketplace between tariffs, economy turmoil, GDP shrinking. A lot of things are going on in North America that impact people's ability or willingness to pay for expensive vehicles. And that is not to be overlooked or undervalued in this situation, but there's a lot to really still be excited about here. Because despite that reduced delivery forecast, total losses that they are projecting for 2025 actually remain stable. They are going to lose still a significant amount of cash, well over $1 billion is expected to be losses for the year. There are good reasons for that, because while this is the second consecutive quarter now of gross margin positive vehicle sales, they are spending a lot of money in a couple key areas. The first is R&D towards getting the Rivian R2 launched in the first half of 2026. This vehicle is going to be extremely important for the overall success of Rivian going forward. And they're also spending considerable amounts of money in both expanding their service and sales footprint. And additionally, they're also building out, sort of a distant third, their fast charging network. Now, if you've watched my prior review about their 6-month ownership with the Gen 2 R1S and Gen 2 R1T, or any of my follow-up reviews, you'll know that my number one reason that someone should consider not buying a Rivian right now is service. So seeing them put a considerable amount of money towards their service centers, and then as well as growing their overall showroom and sales force, is really what they're going to need to tee them up to be successful with that Rivian R2 launch. Now, another item here that is affected by deliveries in the first quarter is their electric delivery van. They have a huge partnership with Amazon where they deliver a lot of these vans to them for their sort of last mile deliveries of Amazon. And they have announced some other trials with a handful of other companies. For instance, Factor or HelloFresh, who owns Factor, is buying a fleet. Overall, their electric delivery van deliveries for the first quarter were lower than they were sort of seasonally. And a big piece of that is because late in 2024, they had part shortages due to a miscalculation on ordering for their Enduro motor, which is used both in the van and the R1S and R1T, for the dual motor variants anyway. And they prioritized the van because the vans only use one of the motors. So they were able to continue to produce more vehicles even with that part shortage. And the vans are great because they have always been positive gross margin for Rivian. And so that has helped them in this, sort of run up and forced focus on positive gross margin. But it did mean that those van sales were pulled forward into Q4 2024, which reflected poorly on Q1 of 2025. So just something to be aware of. Now, I mentioned this is their second consecutive gross margin positive quarter. They generated $206 million of gross margin off of vehicles actually sold, which is an 85% improvement in cash flow compared to the same quarter last year in 2024. The other important piece about having 2 consecutive quarters of gross margin is that this unlocks the next $1 billion in cash in the Volkswagen joint venture. As you know, Rivian has in general been burning a lot of cash, and this joint venture is pretty significant. In fact, I plan to do a second video here in the near future about just how important this joint venture is, which far exceeds the initial cash value that Volkswagen is putting into Rivian as part of the software joint venture for their ECUs and firmware. I think this could be one of the most important things for the company going forward. Second, currently, just getting the Rivian R2 out the door, but I think if you fast forward 5 or 6 years, this joint venture could be just as important, if not more important, than their first-party car business. They do expect to have $3.5 billion available still with future milestones in the Volkswagen joint venture, so that's a not insignificant amount of cash on the table to unlock. And they mentioned, of course, that they have the Department of Energy loan for $6.6 billion, and that is currently still expected to be available for Georgia production. There are some question marks around the current administration potentially reviewing it, even though it was already approved. So we'll just have to wait and see how that shakes out. But as of today, Rivian is expecting that money to be available for them to scale the Georgia plant facility. The rest of 2025 is forecasted to have positive gross margin for every single quarter, which is a big deal for a company who's burned, frankly, as much cash as Rivian has. So the fact that they think that they're going to have an entire year of positive gross margin on their products, really significant. Now, that does lead us into the next item, which is tariff concerns. Now, the story around basically stocking up on battery supply does appear to be true. They do have battery inventory now through early 2026, which is confirmed on the call. I think that is a factor of both reduction in actual unit sales of R1 that they had otherwise maybe forecasted, as well as seeing where the puck was going in terms of tariffs. So I think both of those factors allowed them to get more batteries into the country in advance of tariffs. And so they should be pretty well protected from the most expensive component that we know of inside of the R1 vehicles and the vans into early 2026. Additionally, the Rivian R2 battery production in Arizona should come online in 2027 as their US sourced batteries. We knew that they were going to be partnering with LG Chem with an Arizona location for R2. This is the first place that I've heard personally that is expected to start yielding results in 2027. So that really puts a big question mark on 2026, since they have current source through early 2026 and they're not going to have Arizona until 2027. They did say that the 2026 batteries are likely to be almost exclusively sourced out of South Korea to bridge that gap. So we have to consider, what does that mean in terms of tariffs? What does that mean in terms of being eligible for the Inflation Reduction Act, EV tax credit, and things of that nature? Definitely something to keep an eye on how they may or may not be able to pull that off. They do expect an increase in the overall cost structure in the realm of several $1,000s for both R1S and R1T this calendar year, due specifically to tariffs. But they're doing multiple things to diversify that tariff risk. And they hinted at some of those biggest moving factors being switching up their supplier source so that they can pull from more local suppliers, so they can increase US production capability. I think it's probably no coincidence that just this week as well, they announced that $120 million investment in their supplier park to co-locate their suppliers near to their production facility in Normal, Illinois. I think all of these things are likely connected in their attempts to stay the tariffs, get that, increasing cost down as low as possible, and make sure that they can stay price competitive, because they're already struggling in the R1S and R1T to move them at their current prices. There's really not a lot of headroom to move up, and they want to try to get that in place as quickly as possible for R2. Now, they do caution around the uncertain tariff environment in general going forward, which is frankly just prudent at this point, because it seems like minute by minute, no one really knows what's going to happen. All we know is what's right in front of us at this exact moment. Next, I want to go into some R2 related takeaways. These were some of the more exciting components. I know a lot of you are really excited to get your hands on a Rivian R2. They confirmed that validation builds are indeed underway, which I covered in my previous video We had seen in the photo in the corner, it looked like they were doing a sort of pilot trial production run, and that is exactly what that was. So I was pleased to see that progress is moving forward, and they have early builds that are even being driven around on public roads. RJ and their operations officer talked about driving around in Arizona in the Rivian R2. So I'm excited to see what some of these production builds look like once they're more put together and pieced together, and learn more about what's in them as we continue down this path. And RJ will probably continue to trickle a lot of that out. They did reaffirm that it's going to have that $45,000 starting price. That's even with the most recent tariff information available. I know that a lot of you in the audience have been questioning, can they actually hit 45,000? They may struggle to hit that, I don't know, but they continually reiterate that they want to hit that $45,000 price point. It's important to note that it is before any kind of EV tax incentive. You know, you see things like the Slate truck and whatnot, and you see all these low priced EVs. The asterisk there usually means after rebate. This 45,000 is supposed to be the MSRP, so any rebates would be on top of that if the vehicle is eligible and the rebate still exists. Rivian fully understands that they need a vehicle at this price class in order to compete. While they've been competing a little bit with Tesla, it's hard to really compare a 75 to $100,000+ vehicle against their lower priced products like the Model 3 and Model Y. And I think it's also worth sort of highlighting here that Rivian is not focused on taking sales away from Tesla. Rivian is focused on taking sales away from internal combustion engine vehicles. And Tesla has really laid the foundation in terms of what price point that needs to be to move cars. And it has clearly laid out the roadmap about what price points Rivian needs to hit to start to be competitive. And they also understand that with their future products, such as R3, that the price needs to continue to come down over time. There is a second half 2025 shutdown expected at their Normal, Illinois plant. And the point of this shutdown is to fully integrate the R2 production line with the existing plant operations, since what they're building for R2 is right next to the R1T, R1S, and EDV lines. And they'll have to connect the paint shops and all that kind of stuff so they can move the R2 vehicle back and forth to actually finish production. Okay, so next we have some takeaways about both AI and autonomy. And even though I've been bullish on where Rivian's trying to go with this over the long run because they have so much compute available and they have such a great sensor suite, the language that Rivian chose to use on this particular earnings call was definitely surprising. One of the first things that they revealed is that they actually are planning to do an AI and autonomy day later in the fall of this year, and they want to show off the work that they've been doing with Gen 2 behind the scenes and show off where things are going in the very near future. Their language has turned extremely bullish on their upcoming AI-based autonomy features, and that is going to, I think, surprise quite a few people because, frankly, their autonomy has been kind of ho-hum up until this point. Yes, they've launched things like hands-free driving on Gen 2 in very specific areas of the interstate. I've demoed in multiple videos now that not having a huge coverage map is a big problem. But the Gen 2 hardware is really kind of just getting going from their language and my own personal experience. That enhanced highway assist, which is the hands-free feature I just mentioned, apparently has increased usage of overall lane assist by 30% for Gen 2 customers. And it's amazing that they're, being a software company, can just pull that kind of fleet data. I do believe that they're anonymizing some of it. I don't know that for a fact, but I hope they are. But knowing that the utilization has gone up is hopefully a clear indicator to them that these kinds of features, as they implement and they're good, and they actually execute on it, and then they expand, are going to be a big driving force to not only increase utilization, but also customer satisfaction of the product itself. One of the biggest pieces of feedback that customers like myself and a lot of you end up giving them is, hey, I really like this feature, but I just wish it worked in more places, or I wish it worked more reliably, or I wish it worked in tunnels, or I wish it worked in rural areas. And they fully understand that that is a number one request that customers have. And this kind of data point of an increase of 30% in utilization is a big carrot, underscores just how much executing on this plan can do. They did mention that the Rivian R2 autonomy hardware will be slightly superior to what is shipping today in Gen 2. Now, we know that Gen 2 has an incredible sensor suite in terms of cameras. If you've ever driven a Gen 2 vehicle, you'll know that these cameras are truly first in their industry, first in class, like first class. They are as good as it essentially gets at the moment, with a total of 55 megapixels of available cameras. Across, I believe it's 11 cameras. They are 4K resolution, 60 frames per second, and high dynamic range. Well, R2, even though it's a lower priced vehicle, is expected to not only have more compute, but is actually expected to have more/better cameras. So they let us know in this call that the R2 is expected to now have 65 megapixels worth of surround cameras, which is not insignificant. And that's almost a 20% increase in megapixel count compared to the R1 line currently with Gen 2. So it's a pretty big upgrade in that regard. They did not specifically mention LiDAR yet, although I suspect we may see that in the future. But we do know from prior slides that there's an upgraded computer module that not only has further consolidation of chips on their overall compute board, but they believe it will have 2.4 times the AI performance of what's on Gen 2. During the Q&A section, there was a question about would there be different levels of hardware on different trims of R2 in order to get the price down. And RJ clarified that every trim of Rivian R2 will have the same autonomy suite in terms of sensors and compute. And this may be surprising to cost-cutting people that are like, hey, how to get the price down? You got to decontent that. But it's not surprising if you look at things like the way that Tesla has approached AI and full self-driving in general, because Tesla understands that the entire fleet should have the entire capability in terms of sensors. Now, I know that in Tesla world, they do have radars baked into Model S and Model X, which is their low volume unit, but there's actually not any real proof that that is making a different level of performance on those vehicles. So for all intents and purposes, like all vehicles in Tesla fleet have all the same computers and all the same cameras, more or less. I know there's some bumper cameras and some small differences like that, but there is essentially no difference in any vehicle that they ship, at least in terms of raw overall compute. So hearing RJ confirm that is going to continue to be the case for R2 and all the way down to the bottom end suite is very encouraging. I would also expect that this means that the R1S and the R1T will probably also get a bump in compute and a bump in their camera suite as well. They will continue to have 5 radars, which is 4 corner radars and 1 long-ranging forward-facing radar. So there's plenty of sensor suite there to really make for a sensor fusion and multimodal approach so that you can drive in rain, and you can do things. I mean, our Gen 2 R1S and Gen 2 R1T really do a confident job, even in the rain, when they use their lane centering and adaptive cruise control. There doesn't appear to be any difference in rainy weather compared to bright, sunny, clear weather. So that's really encouraging that they're going to continue forward with having multiple types of modalities and multiple sensor suites going forward. Now, RJ did speak a little bit about the levels of autonomy that are expected in the more near-term future, both for Gen 2 with hardware that's already shipping today, as well as the next level of what's going to be in R2 and, in theory, future iterations of R1. Now, we currently have hands-off, eyes-on support where you can take your hands off the wheel, but you have to look forward on Gen 2, only in select highways. And even then, it's not all highways. But he actually said that hands-off, eyes-on support is coming for essentially all roads. So that includes city streets. And I'm really hoping that this means not only city streets, but this means 100% of what we see in highways. So that includes tunnels, areas that you have roads crossing freeways, where right now it would kick off every time you reach one of those thresholds. I really am looking for additional consistency, even when I need to pay attention to where the car is going and what it's doing. And it seems like that's coming, likely even later this year. Now, I'm a little bit pessimistic on the timeline because they've been late on a lot of their timelines so far, which seems to be a trend in autonomy, but they do seem to be hitting the milestones they need to hit for that to be a thing going forward. One thing that they do plan, though, is that they, with current hardware, to get to both hands-off and eyes-off. So he used the term a true level 3 solution, which means you can play with your phone, you could read a book, you could watch Netflix on the center screen. That is expected for highways in 2026 for Gen 2 and newer. So sometime next year, in theory, you will have zones, specifically highways, likely on-ramp to off-ramp type scenarios, where you can tell the car to start driving and completely zone out, read emails, reply to emails, read a book, eat your breakfast. I mean, it sounds like you'll be able to be awake but unengaged with the driving experience should you choose. I know not everyone is excited about these kinds of features, but I'm very excited about it because I am excited about technology. And if you've ever driven around in Seattle traffic or, LA traffic or New York or whatever, it would be fantastic to have vehicles that in the worst parts of traffic that you still have to get through to get your time back, to release control to the vehicle, and know that it is safer than a human, which is the ultimate goal. Now, I don't believe you'll be able to sleep in it yet with level 3, because you will likely have to take control of the vehicle once you do reach an off-ramp. It's not complete end-to-end, at least with the current hardware of what they're shooting for, but a highway completely hands-off with turn-by-turn and lane change and all that is apparently coming sooner than we think. So I think we're going to learn a lot more about this in the fall when they have their proper AI and autonomy day. Okay, so now I want to touch on just a few notable things that we did not learn during this call. One thing we did not learn about is we weren't given any pricing updates on when the Rivian Autonomy Platform Plus will actually be a paid option, or any indication onto what that will actually cost. In the past, they've talked about both a subscription and a one-time fee, but we'll see if the one-time fee ends up being a thing. I know that they are looking for subscription revenue. I know that they're looking to finance this portion of their business. They've been building up these models and paying a lot of cash towards AWS to run some of their models in the cloud. They're having to hire a lot of engineers for this kind of thing. So we'll see what they end up doing, but they're being a little bit cagey at this point in terms of what these enhanced features are going to be. I suspect that they're really trying to plan on a few more features that they launch first before they start asking people to pay money. And I also expect that as the level of performance for the Rivian Autonomy Platform Plus increases over time, that a subscription price may also increase in lockstep with the feature increase. So I said that before they start charging, I really wanted to see two things. I want to see their comfort assist chip, which has to do with the lane shading away from things like semis, or more comfortably taking some turns with traffic around you, or slowing down when traffic in the lanes adjacent to you is stopped or very, very slow, so that you can increase safety. And I would also like to see their overall lane centering, even if it wasn't hands-free, their general lane centering be consistent and be consistently everywhere. So as soon as they can do those two things, I think a lot more drivers are going to be a lot more willing to actually pay a subscription or potentially even a one-time fee to unlock that feature. They also didn't give any specific timeline for when NACS will be native on the R1S and R1T. I'm assuming this is probably because they don't want to, have the Osborne effect on their sales for existing inventory. I still believe that the NACS is going to be part of a 2026 model year, and those two things will happen at the same time. So maybe that means we're going to get some great deals on 2025s. I don't know. But until they get rid of this extra inventory, I don't think they're in any rush to launch a 2026 with native NACS. The last we've heard is that they actually plan to launch NACS in the calendar year of 2025. When that timing is still a little bit opaque to us. Rivian still hasn't guided to when they believe they will be net cash flow positive as a company versus just gross margin positive. I know that on the recent industry event that Claire McDonough was speaking on, she was a little coy about trying to say when they would be actual net cash flow positive. I think there's just too many factors at play right now, and I suspect that it's probably not going to happen for quite some time. It's probably not going to happen until the Georgia facility is fully built and shipping vehicles, because they really have to get to scale, and they really have to find new ways of generating cash. Now, the things that could change that and pull that timeline forward could be things like more than expected revenue from their autonomy platform. You could have a greater success of the Volkswagen joint venture. We could also see the joint venture expand, because currently the joint venture is only for those ECUs and firmware. It is not for infotainment compute, infotainment design, and it is also not for autonomy at this time, but I could easily see it expanding if it's going well so far with Volkswagen. Speaking of that joint venture, we haven't learned very much about additional automaker interest in the products and services from that joint venture. At one point, they had said that there were some preliminary talks with other manufacturers, but nothing really concrete and nothing that would generate additional money for that JV that Rivian has a clear stake in and is getting paid by Volkswagen to basically co-develop. I think traditional OEMs seem like a really great candidate here, especially when you look at people like Ford, who just gave up on building their own ECUs. I think this joint venture, even as it is formed and shaped today with the products and services that they're building in lockstep with Volkswagen, have a lot of marketability right now. That is even before we talk about the potential of them expanding that, as I just mentioned, with autonomy or in-cabin experiences as those continue to improve inside of a Rivian. So this is kind of the quick recap. This is very different than what I've done in other videos. I hope you found this information useful and helpful. My sort of core takeaway here is that Rivian is in a stronger position than I would have otherwise guessed, given the significant drop in vehicles delivered last quarter. I'm really proud of them for having gross margin positive for 2 quarters in a row. I realize that is propped up by things like, selling those clean energy credits and things like that. But at this stage of the company, it's kind of, scrape and claw what you can do to bring money in the door. And that all contributes to the cash at the end of the day. My dad used to always say, all money is green. So however they need to get it is great. I think that they are clearly focused on Rivian R2, which is the right focus. And they are surprisingly increasing their language and what they say about the autonomy part, which gets me personally excited. But we'll really have to see what the fall event for the AI and Autonomy Day brings. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. What do you think about the format though? Leave a comment down below. Let me know. Do you want to see more videos like this? Train of thought, feedback from a software CEO about how Rivian's doing as a company? Let me know either way down in the comments. We could skip it in the future. We could do it as a quarterly thing. Really excited to see what happens next. But until then, stay curious.